The top 1% of Americans now hold more wealth than the entire bottom 90% combined. And the gap is not slowing down. It is accelerating. And the reason it keeps accelerating has nothing to do with hustle or talent or luck. It has to do with a system, a set of interlocking mechanisms that quietly rewards people who already have money and quietly punishes people who don't. Not through malice, through math. What we're going to walk through today is how that system actually works, layer by layer. Not as a political argument, as a mechanical one. Because once you understand the machinery, you stop seeing wealth inequality as some abstract concept, and you start seeing it as a chain of cause and effect that most people are never taught to recognize. Let's start with the number that sets the scene. According to Federal Reserve distributional financial accounts data, the top 1% of households in the United States control 30.9% of all wealth in this country. The bottom 50%, that's 165 million people, control 2.5%. That gap has grown consistently since 1989, when the top 1% held 23% and the bottom 50% held 3.4%. The bottom half actually lost ground over 35 years. And the top didn't just win, they lapped the field. Here's where it gets interesting. Because most people assume this is a story about income, about who earns more. It's not. Income is almost irrelevant to this equation once you understand how wealth is actually built. Wealth is built through assets, and assets, particularly the ones wealthy people own, grow in ways that earned income never can. Let's talk about the tax code first, because this is the mechanism nobody explains clearly. When you go to work and earn a paycheck, the government taxes that money as ordinary income. Depending on how much you make, the federal rate ranges from 10% all the way up to 37%. That's for wages, the kind of income most Americans live on. Now here's the contrast. When a wealthy investor sells a stock they'd held for more than 1 year, that profit is taxed as a long-term capital gain. The maximum federal rate on that gain? 20%. Plus a 3.8% net investment income surcharge for high earners, which brings it to 23.8%. Still more than 13 percentage points below the top ordinary income rate. Think about what that actually means. A hedge fund manager who earns $10 million from investment gains pays a lower tax rate than a nurse, a teacher, or a contractor earning $89,000 a year. Same dollar amount of income, wildly different tax treatment. The tax code was written to reward passive wealth accumulation over active work. That's not an opinion. That's the rate schedule, plain and simple. But here's the part that makes the gap compound. It's not just the rate, it's how long wealth can sit and grow before being taxed at all. If you buy a stock and never sell it, you owe zero taxes on that appreciation for as long as you hold it. A billionaire can watch their portfolio grow by $500 million in a year and pay nothing because the gain is unrealized. Meanwhile, a salaried employee gets taxed on every dollar before they ever see it. One group pays taxes on money they're about to use, the other group doesn't pay until they choose to, and many never choose to. Now stack the next layer on top, asset appreciation itself. The S&P 500 has averaged a nominal return of around 10% annually over the past century. In 2024 alone, the market returned over 25%. Meanwhile, the average national savings account rate in the United States sat well below 1% for most of 2024. Even high-yield savings accounts that grabbed headlines for their good rates were paying around 4 to 5%, which sounds solid until you realize the stock market more than quintupled those returns in the same calendar year. Now here's the brutal reality. The top 1% of Americans own 49.9% of all equities and mutual fund shares in this country. The bottom 50% own just 1% of the stock market. So when the S&P 500 climbs 25% in a year, that gain lands almost entirely in the accounts of people who are already wealthy. The people at the bottom, who hold their money in checking and savings accounts, don't participate. They're not losing out on a bet. They were never allowed at the table. When you only have $3,500 in a bank account earning less than 1%, you're not building wealth. You're barely treading water against inflation. This is not a discipline problem. This is a capital problem. You cannot invest what you do not have, and the system has made sure that the threshold to participate keeps moving further out of reach. Real estate follows the exact same pattern, and it's the other primary engine of middle-class wealth that is becoming increasingly unreachable. Homeownership is the single largest wealth-building tool available to most Americans. A home appreciates, it builds equity, it can be passed down. Between 1990 and 2024, median home prices increased by more than 400% in the United States. Median household income over that same period rose by less than 200%. The gap between those two numbers is the reason Gen Z and millennials are renting into their 30s in numbers that previous generations never experienced. According to Federal Reserve data, 87% of Americans earning over $100,000 per year own their home. For Americans earning under $50,000 per year, that number drops to 36%. And the income gap in homeownership is even more pronounced for adults under 60, where the rate among high earners is more than 3 times the rate among low earners. Every year a household rents instead of owns, that household builds zero equity, while their landlord's asset appreciates. The renter's money goes to the owner's balance sheet, permanently. The people who do own homes have watched their net worth climb. The people who don't are watching home prices drift further away. And because homes require down payments that require savings that require surplus income, the people who most need the asset are the most locked out of it. And then inheritance comes in and calcifies the whole structure. Cerulli Associates projects that $124 trillion will transfer from older to younger generations by 2048. $124 trillion. Of that, roughly 50%, around $62 trillion, is expected to flow from households in the top 2% of wealth. 2% of households controlling half of the greatest wealth transfer in American history. Here's what that means in practice. If you are born into a wealthy family, you are not just receiving a financial gift, you are receiving a compressed timeline. You skip the years of building, the risky early career decisions, the years of paying rent while your wealthier peers buy homes with parental help. You skip the interest payments, you skip the student debt, and because of how compounding works, that head start doesn't just add to your net worth, it multiplies it. A $100,000 inheritance at age 25 invested in the S&P 500 with that historical 10% annual return becomes roughly $1.7 million by age 65. Not because of genius, because of time and starting position. Now compare that to the inheritance reality for most Americans. The average inheritance received by the bottom half of the wealth distribution is around $9,700. That's not enough to clear most people's credit card debt, let alone start building generational wealth. And white families are nearly 4 times more likely to receive an inheritance than black families, and 5 times more likely than Hispanic families. The gap isn't just economic, it's deeply layered. And the estate tax, the mechanism designed to slow this concentration, has been rendered nearly toothless. The federal estate tax exemption for 2025 stands at $13.99 million per person, meaning a couple can transfer just under $28 million to their heirs completely free of federal estate tax. Wealthy families with proper legal planning can reduce what gets taxed even further through trusts, gifting strategies, and family LLCs. The estate tax, in practice, applies to a tiny fraction of estates, and the families who face it have armies of advisors to minimize the bill. But here is the mechanism that almost never gets talked about clearly. It's not just that wealthy families have more money to pass down. It's that they have access to entirely different financial products. Consider credit. When a wealthy person needs capital to buy an investment property or fund a business, they walk into a bank with assets, collateral, and credit history. They get a loan at a low interest rate, sometimes under 7%. When someone in the bottom half of the wealth distribution needs capital for an emergency, a car repair, a medical bill, a broken appliance, they often have none of those things. No collateral, no credit history, no family to borrow from. They end up at a payday lender, paying effective annual interest rates that regularly exceed 300%. Same need for capital, radically different cost. One group borrows money that makes them more money, the other borrows money that drains them. And while this is happening, the investment account gap does its own quiet damage. Over 1/3 of full-time American workers have no access to a 401k, a pension, or any employer-sponsored retirement vehicle. These are people who cannot defer income, cannot get an employer match, cannot invest pre-tax dollars in index funds. They're not lazy. They work at small businesses, in service industries, in jobs that don't offer those benefits. Meanwhile, a dual-income household with access to 2 401ks and employer matches is effectively receiving a pay raise from their employer every year, a raise that compounds tax-free for decades. Now step back and look at all 5 mechanisms together. The tax code, Asset appreciation, homeownership barriers, inheritance, and credit access. None of them work in isolation. They stack. The family that inherits money buys a home earlier. The home appreciates. They use the home equity to invest. Those investments are taxed at a lower rate than their neighbor's wages. When they die, they transfer the accumulated gains to their children at a stepped-up cost basis, meaning the appreciation built over a lifetime faces zero capital gains tax at death. Their children receive assets, not debts, and the cycle restarts. The family on the other side rents longer. Their income is taxed at ordinary rates. They carry student debt that reduces savings capacity at exactly the age when compounding matters most. Every dollar not invested in your 20s is roughly $5 you don't have in your 60s. They eventually buy a home later, if they can, with less equity and more debt. And when they die, they often leave nothing, or leave debt. Here's what 35 years of data shows. This is not a fluke. From 1989 to 2024, the top 1% increased their share of American wealth from 23% to 30.9%. The bottom 50% went from 3.4% to 2.5%. That isn't inequality failing to close. That is inequality being engineered wider, year after year, by rules that seem neutral but are anything but. And here's the part that should make you stop and think. The S&P 500 in 2024 returned over 25%. Real estate in most major markets has doubled in a decade. The returns on assets are enormous right now, and the people who own those assets are getting wealthier faster than at almost any point in American history. The $124 trillion wealth transfer is already underway. The question isn't whether it's happening, it's which side of it you're on. Understanding the system is not the same as being resigned to it. Knowing how the machinery works is the first step to building a position inside it rather than outside it. That means prioritizing asset ownership over income accumulation whenever possible. It means understanding the tax advantages of long-term investing versus short-term income. It means making the home purchase decision through the lens of equity building, not monthly payment math. It means looking at a 401k employer match, not as a perk, but as a guaranteed return on investment that starts day one. None of that changes the system, but it changes what you can do inside it. And I want to know, which part of this hits closest to home for you? Is it the tax code, the homeownership gap, the inheritance math? Drop it in the comments, because I genuinely read them, and the answers shape what we cover next. If this laid out something you hadn't quite seen this clearly before, hit the like button and share it with someone who needs to see it, because this is the kind of video that makes more sense the second time you watch it. And subscribe if you're not already, because next week we're going into the exact strategies people inside the top 10% actually use to stay there, and which of those strategies anyone can start using right now.